Hi guys! So it's Dr. Rush here again. Now it's been a while since I talked to you guys about the insulin resistance series that I'd commenced, that I uploaded or updated on that. Quarantine lockdowns got to me, like it probably has most of you. Now I'm looking off to the side because I'm new to YouTube, and what I want to do is now bring everything I've been telling you about insulin resistance together. And I've got it here all on my trusty iPhone. So I'm going to kind of look back and forth, read from the screen, look at you, read from the screen, because I want to get this right. There's a lot of information I want to cover. Okay, so I just want to start by explaining who I am, and I'm an infectious diseases pediatrician who does also adult infectious diseases and who has who did a diploma of a fellowship of travel and tropical medicine, a fellowship of travel and tropical medicine. And my dissertation was on obesity in developing countries and in colonized populations. I myself have had insulin resistance. I was overweight for a period there. I had fatty liver, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and terrible reflux. And I lost 16 kilos, which is about 35, 38 pounds. I've put on back about half of that. So I've put on about 8 kilos back. And I'm down on the downward trajectory, losing it again. 2020 does that to us, has done that to a lot of us, hasn't it? So I'm going to start telling you again about insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is actually a genetic tendency to be extremely fuel efficient and to store every calorie away for future use. So insulin resistance is a good thing, okay? It was very useful in the past when there were famines and droughts and nutritional challenges, when people went on long sea voyages, such as how the Pacific Islands were populated. So it was a very, very useful facility to be able to store away every calorie very effectively in the past. You can see that my glasses, I might have to take them off. I think it's going to reflect in my glasses. What do I do? No, still going to do it. Okay, so makes sense so far. I hope that makes sense. So because insulin resistance is such good survival genetics, it's the ability of the body to store away every spare calorie for future use, it's been passed on down through the generations as this excellent thing for the human race to survive, is for it to be insulin resistant. But in the last 20 to 30 years, the nutritional environment has radically changed, so that we have easy access to processed carbs and food and minimal absolute requirement to move. The food comes to us. We don't have to chase the food. So storing all those calories away for future use becomes less critical. So because insulin resistance confers all this fuel efficiency and ability to store every calorie, in an environment where you don't really need to draw on those stored calories, then the calories pile up and add up and add up, and you develop obesity rather than just a little bit of extra padding to see you through the lean times. So eventually obesity becomes diabetes. Okay, eventually obesity becomes diabetes. The more genetically insulin resistant you are, the more prone you are to developing diabetes when you're obese. So diabetes is the inability to handle carbohydrates. Now, all carbohydrates get converted into, broken down into sugar in the gut and transported into your cells. And inside your cells, the sugar has three destinies, or as an Indian person, I say three dharma. I'm Christian, I'm actually Christian, but that's my culture, that's my heritage. So the three destinies, or the three dharma of the sugar inside the cell, the first is it gets converted to energy to carry out your activities of living. And then the second destiny is some of it gets repackaged into carbohydrates, into long chain carbohydrates or starches. And the human form of starch is glycogen. And the third, what's left over, is then converted into fat. Now, it's actually in the liver and the muscle that carbohydrates get converted into glycogen, because that's where glycogen is stored. And only a limited amount of carbohydrates get converted into glycogen. So, what does insulin do? So insulin is released by an organ sitting underneath the stomach called the pancreas. And what insulin does is it opens the door to the cell to allow the sugar inside the cell. So insulin is like a key, and the key unlocks the door, okay? And the lock on the door is the receptor. So insulin binds to the receptor, unlocks the door, okay, unlocks the receptor, opens the cell door and allows the sugar into the cell to be converted into fat, or to be utilized, or to be stored as glycogen. Okay, so insulin resistance, okay, is when the cell doesn't really recognize the action of the insulin, so that the lock doesn't really respond to the insulin. You know, when you've got a sticky lock that doesn't quite, a sticky key that doesn't quite fit the lock, or a sticky lock that doesn't quite, the key gets jammed, that's insulin resistance. So insulin is like a key that gets jammed in the state of insulin resistance. So the reason that bodies have evolved to have a little bit of this sticky mismatch between the insulin receptor and the insulin ligand, we call it, or the hormone, is this. The pancreas pumps out extra insulin to deal with the insulin resistance receptor. The pancreas pumps out extra insulin to kind of flood that insulin resistance receptor. The side effect of that extra insulin is it pushes the sugar into the cell by force. So that extra insulin kind of pushes against the receptor and by force pushes the sugar in. But then all that large amount of insulin actually has a side effect. The side effect of large amounts of insulin is that once it's pushed the sugar into the cell, it actually pushes the sugar down the fat storage pathway. Okay? So the cells, if they are insulin resistant, force the body to produce more insulin, which increases the fat storage ability or activity of insulin. And that would have been very useful in times past where we needed to store every calorie away as fat for future use. So it's a positive feedback loop. If the receptor is resistant to insulin, the pancreas pumps out more insulin, which pushes the body towards fat storage. Okay? In the past, where we weren't giving our body too many excess calories and we were so busy and active, we didn't end up storing that much away as fat. Right? The insulin resistance led to the laying down of a small amount of fat, and that allowed us to survive hard and lean times. So instead, what happens is this. In the modern environment, we end up laying down calories as fat, but we have so much calories, we end up with abundant fat. Okay? Insulin resistance leads to a pumping out of insulin, which leads to fat storage, which never really gets used up unless we make a categorical effort to use it up, because we don't have those lean or very active times. And now, this is where the positive feedback loop comes in. The fat from the insulin is generally stored in the midsection and the upper body. And there's a side effect of that central fat. The side effect of that fat is it makes your body cells even more resistant to insulin. So you've got insulin resistance. Insulin resistance leads to fat laying down. And then all that fat that lays down makes the cells even more resistant to insulin, right? So therefore you lay down even more fat because the cells are even more resistant to insulin. And so your cells, you start to spiral into obesity and diabetes. Can you see that? And eventually, the pancreas can't pump out enough insulin to deal with the increasingly resistant cells. So the sugar builds up in the bloodstream instead of entering the cells. And sugar, when it builds up in the bloodstream, that's called type 2 diabetes. And sugar poisons the nerves in the blood vessels. When you don't have enough insulin because the pancreas is, you're not pumping out enough insulin to overcome the resistance, and then the pancreas starts to fatigue. The beta cells of the pancreas can't pump out enough insulin because they start to run out of their ability to generate and produce and pump out insulin. They start to fatigue. Then the sugar builds up and poisons the blood vessels and nerves. And then people get diabetic gangrene, they get blindness, they get kidney failure, they get stroke, they get heart disease, they get, as we've seen, impaired immunity, death, and infections, including COVID-19. Okay? Before that, people get into a pre-diabetic phase. That's when they eat carbs, the cells are resistant to insulin. The pancreas surges out insulin, as I said, and then the insulin comes out in a huge rush. And then the carbs enter the cells, but often it overshoots. And so then the blood sugar drops as the sugar enters the cells. And then the body has to produce a bunch of hormones like cortisol, noradrenaline, and adrenaline to pull the sugar back out of the cells. And that drop in sugar and then that rush of adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol all leads to symptoms. So those symptoms are you get jittery, you get irritable, you get your heart palpitates, you can be sweaty, you can feel nauseated, you feel stressed. That's the kind of hypoglycemia kind of wave, right? So there also appears to be some neurological side effects from insulin. Like I get very severe carb comas. If I eat too many carbs and I don't exercise, then I get really sleepy. So it appears that insulin affects what proteins cross the blood-brain barrier, act on certain neurotransmitters and make you sleepy. So the key is to reduce the amount of insulin we need. And then everything winds back in the right direction. If you reduce the amount of insulin you need, you reduce the amount of fat you lay. If you reduce the amount of fat you lay, you reduce the resistance of the cells. If you reduce the resistance of the cells, you reduce the amount of insulin you need, and it winds backwards, if that makes sense. Okay, so my next video, I'm going to talk about the 6 steps to overcome insulin resistance. Thank you.